And so I'm continuing in Luke's Gospel, and we're in Luke 10. And it's a passage that begins with what I think is a striking text. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, this is a passage which contains several questions between Jesus and the lawyer. The questions all seem to proceed in a straightforward manner. And Jesus brings the dialogue to a conclusion with one final question. And I'll read that to you too, from verse 29 in this particular passage. These are the words that we read there. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbour?" Still one of the most fundamental of all questions. And who is my neighbour? And the parable of the Good Samaritan concludes with the question, reading in verse 37, the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." Very powerful. Something very, very real that happens in that particular section. You see, in the Good Samaritan, a story that many of us are familiar with, a priest and a Levite feature in the story. And they may have had very justifiable reasons for not caring for a man who'd fallen down. I don't think that Jesus has got it in for these people. He's just using them as being important illustrations. But the Samaritan did all that he could. You see, so often Jesus told stories that had three aspects to them, three characters, three cameo stories, things that were gathered together in threes. But it is the most unlikely of the three, the Samaritan, that did what was most required. And he's the one that demonstrates what neighbourliness is all about. And you see, the parable is powerful. And the conclusion of the parable says it all. So you go through this parable. You see an example of a man in need and somebody who is very, very much about getting on his way to do something that's important about religion, somebody who's got responsibilities. They're all people who have decent reasons for not being able to stop. But there's obviously a busy man, because we're told in the parable that the man who did stop, the Samaritan, was so busy he had to go away once he'd put him there and come back and pay on his return for the expenses incurred by this particular man being taken into care who'd fell among thieves. And you see, the unlikeliness of the one that will care is really a picture of what it must be for us if we're to be engaged, involved as real neighbours in our society, in our world. If we're to be followers of Jesus, it'll be very much that we're prepared to be the unlikely one. We're prepared to recognise in the unlikely one the one that shows compassion, care and love. It's a marvellous story, the Good Samaritan. You know, I think it's taken for granted. There are two parables that I think that's true of. What we know as the lost sons, the prodigal son, some will remember it as, and the Good Samaritan. They're very, very powerful. And there's never been a better, more significant time for us to understand the need for us to be neighbours. Neighbours in our community, neighbours in Australia, neighbours with those who've come to Australia and are knowing what it is to be finding themselves in a new country and nowhere to turn. We need to be those people doing the unlikely thing in the unlikely place to the unlikely person from the unlikely one. You know, it's really, really powerful. I think it's not just a children's story told once or twice, but it's one that powerfully impacts upon our social view of society and what we're going to do for other people. And Jesus, I think, was inviting people to make a choice. Choose, if you like, which one out of these three is the neighbour. Choose, if you like. Is it the one who's carrying out religious duties? Is it the one who's got responsibilities? Or is it the one who stops, puts himself in danger to be willing to help the one in trouble? Now, I think that really does resonate with real needs that we have today in terms of understanding what our neighbour is. And then, you know, the reason why we can apply it in this kind of way to our society is summed up really in those words that are there. The expert in the law, which of these three do you think was the neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? That's the question. The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And then that text concludes. Jesus told him, Go and do likewise. I mean, we may not find ourselves having to be there when people fall into trouble, but we might have to be the good neighbour, the one who is if you like, the Good Samaritan to those in need in our modern Australia, in our cities, regional areas, and amongst people in need. And our guests today on this show, both in conversation and in music, have had to understand that in their own lives. This is a parable that says it all.